there's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on. It's early August in Sydney in the year 2000, and the city is gearing up to host the Olympics. 2 Year 12 girls aged 17 and 18 are at Chatswood Shopping Centre chatting to a group of teenage boys. They're offered a lift home, so they accept, hopping into a white van with the group. They're taken to Greenacre in the city's west, where they're slapped, threatened, pushed and raped by a total of 8 males. 2 days later, the group strikes again, giving a 16-year-old girl a lift into the city. Taken to a park and ambushed by a group of 14, the teenager is raped by 2 of them, while the others watch on and laugh. On August 30, an 18-year-old woman is approached by the group on a train to Bankstown. She's persuaded to get off with them, tricked into entering a public toilet, and raped over and over, both there and in 2 other locations. She's sexually assaulted by 14 men and boys in total over the course of 6 terrifying hours. As a final humiliation, they hose her down and throw her into the street near a train station. In early September, 2 16-year-old girls are picked up from another railway station in the city's southwest. They're repeatedly raped by 3 males over a period of 5 hours. This series of horrific crimes becomes known as the Skaf gang rapes, named after the gang's ringleaders, brothers Bilal and Mohammed Skaf. The magnitude of the horror they subjected their victims to left our country in a state of shock and outrage, with a judge describing the offences as events that you hear about or read about only in the context of wartime atrocities. The group, aged between 16 and 20, consisted of up to 14 boys and men, but only 9 were convicted, sentenced to a total of more than 240 years in prison. Only one of them remains behind bars. I'm Gemma Barth, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. Our guest today led the prosecution of the 2000 Skaf gang rapes. Margaret Cunneen SC has enjoyed a long career as a Crown Prosecutor and Deputy Senior Crown Prosecutor, leading hundreds of judge-only and jury criminal trials and appeals in the New South Wales Court of Criminal Appeal and High Court of Australia. She's recorded a long succession of convictions against rapists and murderers, including the butcher of Bega and pedophile Robert Dolly Dunn, and has served as Commissioner of the New South Wales Special Commission of Inquiry into matters relating to the police investigation of certain child sexual abuse allegations in the Roman Catholic Diocese of Maitland, Newcastle. She's had her fair share of controversy too. At the end of 2014, she was investigated by the New South Wales ICAC, who were pursuing her for corrupt conduct. She was accused of perverting the course of justice for advising her son's girlfriend to fake chest pains to avoid a breath test after a car crash. She was fully exonerated, and her involvement in the inquiry at all was revealed to be a big misunderstanding. Retiring from public office in 2019, Margaret embarked on a brand new chapter, doing the complete professional opposite of what she's done for so long, defending the accused instead of prosecuting them. Her career is outlined in a chronicle called The Boxing Butterfly, which explores some of her biggest cases and moments. Margaret joins us now. Margaret, you've had a very big career. Do you have a proudest moment? Is that something you're even able to do with so many achievements?
I do have one, and it's fairly recent, and it's in my time as Defence Counsel, because my career is now 48 years old at the end of this year, 48 years of full-time work. My goodness. No wonder I feel tired. The big moment for me, the biggest achievement, was winning a case that perhaps most people wouldn't have seen the success in. And it's the case of Kulwinder Singh, who was charged with burning his wife to death. Mm-hmm. And I sensed very much a bit of a racist persecution going on, and even that the Crown was going to get an expert to say that Indian men burn their wives. And on her short list to prove it, this expert, who'd never been to India, by the way, she already had Mr. Singh's name on it, and he hadn't been convicted. And as it happened, there was plenty of evidence in that case, plenty of forensic evidence, and it all pointed to the deceased woman having set herself on fire, but not to burn herself. It was a mistake. She used petrol instead of kerosene. She'd prepared herself. She'd put her hair up that she usually had down in a wet towel. She prepared everything, and hers were the only fingerprints and DNA on the petrol can and on the lighter. But poor Mr. Singh, who I could faithfully say to the jury has never had a drink, smoke, gambled, didn't have anyone on the side, so to speak, never been to a brothel, casino, nothing, just a hard-working guy with a lovely family. It wasn't him, but he was treated so badly by everyone who assumed it must have been, that he did it to her. So it was a hard-won victory because the first trial was conducted in a way which wasn't allowed the second time, by the prosecution desperate for a conviction and breaking it up. Well, even if she did it, you forced her to, and all these different permutations. But finally, that was a hung jury. The second time, we were able to keep the Crown to admissible evidence, and the jury very quickly came back with a not guilty verdict. But he spent a lot of his own money. He did 4 months in jail and he's just suffered so much. And it just shows that investigators ought not to jump to conclusions, and that the legal process testing all the evidence is there for a good reason.
It's interesting that you pick a proudest moment from your, I'm going to call it second act, because you spent so much time on the other side prosecuting cases. What has it been like spending the last few years in defence?
Yes, 6 years now. I didn't know whether anyone would brief me. I left the Crown at 60 and thought, well, that's the sort of where the super comes to a sort of stop. So let's see what it's like. Will anyone brief me?
Yeah.
But I didn't get any briefs from the prosecution,
Really?
None. And so I was briefed by many different defence solicitors, most of whom I'd never worked with, but there's just so much work, and I'm still turning it away and booked out well into or towards the end of next year. So it's true that I did some wonderful cases as a Crown prosecutor, and I'm still in contact with dozens of families, especially bereaved parents of children who were killed, such as Lindsay Van Blanken, whose body was found in a cricket bag. I'm still friends with her mum and her sister. But in a sense, Gemma, I've got to say that it's a bit more of a challenge on the defence side. It's generally more straightforward on the prosecution side if you're on the correct side.
Yeah.
And you should be. By the time a trial gets up, the Crown Prosecutor should be very confident of the evidence and very confident of the way the matter should go by having made sure that it's all been tested to some degree and everything checked before someone is put on trial. But from the defence point of view, being against the zeitgeist, against the publicity and the tendency now, it seems to me, for people to make up their mind before someone is convicted. And so that's a very negative influence carrying through the trial. And it's very hard for people, especially people in the public eye who get put on trial, because so often it's as though they've already been convicted just when they're charged. And people forget that, as they would want if they were charged, they'd want the evidence to be tested and proved beyond reasonable doubt.
Everyone is innocent until they're not.
Yes.
So is that a welcome challenge for you?
Well, I was daunted by it
Yeah.
and thought it might be difficult to change, because I used to be criticised a lot for this. I get very close to the people I work with, and I was criticised very much, and I think perhaps in a somewhat sexist fashion for decades.
Agreed.
for being just affectionate with young women who'd been terribly assaulted or parents who'd lost a child. And warmed to those people and thought it would be easier for them if they knew how much it meant to me for them to get justice. And so I've been criticised for hugging people and having my arm around people and so forth.
Showing kindness.
Yeah, that's it. Yes. Oh, yes. We must have none of that.
Mustn't be kind.
And yes, that's right. Even if we're mothers and grandmothers and
in the worst moments of their lives.
Yes, it is the worst moment of anyone's life to go through a court process, and the more serious the case, the worse it is for all parties. And so you can see that people need kindness. But then when I was a prosecutor and I saw a woman just quietly crying, and I knew it was the mother of the man who'd just been convicted of murder, and I saw her crying there, and she was a mum, and I asked the defence counsel, could I just go and see her? And I ended up holding her and hugging her because no one else was. So we have to have humanity in our justice system because it's very much a part of it. It's not a mathematical calculation. It's even the determination of these cases has so much. It relies on so much knowledge of human nature.
And court is scary. If you haven't been in one, I've covered them as a court reporter. They're really intimidating places.
Yes.
And so these families have often never sat foot in a court before, and suddenly there's judges, there's prosecutors, there's defence, there's criminals, and it's like very overwhelming.
Yes, in a bit of an arcane language too, perhaps deliberately set so that people don't quite know what's going on.
Yeah.
And the intimidation is deliberate too, to try to scare people into telling the truth. I don't know if it really works like that anymore. That, like many other of the trappings of the criminal justice system, have changed a lot in the 40-odd years I've been in it.
It's probably a good segue to bring me to a sentence in your book that really stood out to me right at the start in the introduction. And it said, "She has been trenchantly attacked by some colleagues in the profession. Perhaps they mistook her niceness for weakness." It was an observation by your co-author. What would you say to that? Because that kind of speaks to what you've just been saying about people looking at you showing empathy and kindness and
Yes.
positive emotion as a weakness.
For a few decades, I think it was ago, I noticed that people thought that if you're quite pleasant and polite with people and nice to people, polite with the other side, you can't be taking it seriously enough. You've got to walk in there with a stern look and don't get too close to people and be a bit of an object rather than a person. But, well, I've just continued to do it my way, and if people don't like it, well, many of the people who don't like it aren't there anymore, so it doesn't matter.
And you've got your achievements to show.
Yes.
You have spoken before about your own experience of sexual abuse in your childhood. Did that help to inform your why when you entered this career, and also, I guess, the empathy that you have?
It certainly did inform me because I knew very well from when I first started working in the prosecution of child sexual assault in the 1980s, I knew things that other people who only had a theoretical knowledge didn't appreciate. And one of the main things is how child sexual abuse can happen virtually under the noses of parents. And so it's not really an answer to say, oh, well, the parents were there and how could this have happened? Because so much of it is furtive, grooming behaviour. And I also understood that a long time ago, and in the 60s when I was a child, there was very little ability to say something about a respected adult and be believed. And especially if a small child was talking about parts of the body or something that was regarded as rude or shocking for a child to say, it was very hard for them to get the message across. And I remember getting very, very sternly treated when I was trying to tell people who should have known, and I used, at about the age of 6 or 7, used the word penis to try to tell the message. And I got hit
Really?
for using that word. So I didn't bother to tell the same people again until I was an adult.
Just goes to show, though, I would hope that nowadays, young children, I'm teaching my 2-year-old about consent, or trying to.
Yes.
Teaching him about body parts. Like, we're just so much more knowledgeable.
We are so much more knowledgeable. There seemed to be in that generation of people, they weren't all like this, but there was such a people would just take a sharp intake of breath at the mention of anything sexual. It was also behind the curtain. And so I think it's so much more healthy that everyone just takes sexual matters in their stride, and it's not something that only people of a certain age can talk about in hushed tones. So good for you with your little boy.
You've been involved in so many high-profile cases during your time as a prosecutor and Crown Prosecutor. Too many to touch on in this episode, so I want to hone in on one, the Skaf gang rapes. Would you say that it's among one of the cases you're asked about the most?
Yes, I'm asked about that the most.
Really?
The most.
Why do you think that is?
There's a few reasons. Those offences took place in August 2000, so it was kind of a change of history in a sense, and it was just before the Olympics. The occurrence of the crimes was a bit concealed by authorities at the time so that there wasn't a huge panic. But there were 15 men in a gang, not always all together, but easily able with the relatively new invention of mobile phones to get together and to have sort of a military type operation, just so that there'd be literally shifts of men coming in to assault a young woman or two. It was really shocking. The mobile telephones gave us a lot more detail, and so too did the victims were extremely articulate and well able to give so many descriptions of what happened. One victim in particular who was involved with this gang over 6 hours and 4 locations. Her memory of it was so impressive because not just because there was a lot of detail in a statement. That can happen anytime, and a prosecutor or a police officer isn't sure whether it's true or not. But so much of the detail was able to be checked because of the other relatively new thing of CCTV on a railway station. Mm-hmm. But even details like the one in the yellow jumper had something to do with his private area, and that turned out to be true. And so she was so she just took it all in, even through the stress of probably believing at the end she might be killed, just going through something so terrible but remembering so accurately, because mobile phones backed up what she said about he left and he came back and so forth. And mobile phones, I suppose that this was the first case where mobile phones were used so much in the detection of the offenders. And I learnt things like a mobile tower being able to say not just that it's picked up on that tower, but which of 3 sectors the direction of the call comes from. So even if some of the offenders lived close to the mobile tower, their home wasn't in the correct sector. And so they were found out that way. And the other interesting thing about the mobile telephone that I learnt then and will never forget is during the offences, Miss C, as she was called by the court, heard her own ringtone. Her phone had been taken from her, and heard her ringtone, which was the real Slim Shady Eminem.
Very 2000s?
Yes, that's right. She saw one of the offenders answer his phone with that and saw it was her phone. But in the end, they gave her back her phone, but he had put his SIM card in there because he liked the phone ringtone or both and used it that night. Perhaps he used it to ring people and didn't want it on his phone, or who knows, probably as simple as wanted to try that phone out. But then, as I learnt for the first time in the preparation for that case, every phone, even then the old Nokias, the phone sends a message of the call and the SIM card sends a separate message of the call. So it could be proved that the call was made with his SIM card and her phone. So that linked them so that he couldn't get out of it at all, even though, of course, he said, I was at home, it wasn't me, it was someone who looked like me and so forth. So
this kind of technological side of investigation, that was fairly new back then.
It really was. It was the first sexual assault case I'd ever done that was investigated like a murder.
Because I've heard it said that the brief of evidence that you got was as good as you would get for a murder, which is impressive in a sexual assault case, right?
It really was. And it was such a a big strike force of about a dozen fantastic detectives many of whom had homicide experience. They did it like that. So it was not just a usual case at that time, of alleged sexual assault where there'd be a statement from the complainant and perhaps a statement from a doctor and a statement from a police officer saying we arrested the guy and he wouldn't say anything and that's that. And that was all you got. But in this case, there was so much more CCTV and all the phone evidence, which was fascinating.
Which makes your job easier, right? I mean, this is not an easier case, but you want as much detail as possible.
That's right. And as much as we know that it still doesn't prove whether sexual intercourse is rape or not, in a case like this it sure does. In the back of buildings, with men coming and going, different cars coming and going, and more offences taking place. It was obvious that that complainant and all the other complainants were there against their will and certainly not consenting to these waves of men who were arriving.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the names that people might remember, and it's the reason it's called the Skaf rape? So the Mohammed and Bilal Skaf, who were the kind of ringleaders, or Bilal was the ringleader.
Yes.
What was the setup? They were the brothers that were kind of running it?
Yeah, they were in a sense. Bilal was always involved and Mohammed was a bit of a runner for him. Mohammed was only 16 at the time. And he he's still in the news.
Yes, he is.
He's still in the news, but he was 16 and Bilal was 18. I'm not trying to take away from their crimes, but there were a few features in their upbringing that seemed to scream out that they weren't necessarily brought up to respect young Australian women.
Yeah.
That was very clear from their supporters and members of their family and the way that they would harass the victims, well, at the time complainants, but imagine that women associated with them were harassing.
Well, you're kind of touching around the edges on the racial motivation side of this case, which is kind of what the media ran with. You know, it got this huge, this is a racially motivated attack, and it kind of was stemming from the fact that the victims were being called things like Aussie pigs, you deserve it because you're Australian. How did that side of things overtake this case, particularly in the media?
Yes, well, as I've always said, I wouldn't have ever mentioned any racial aspect of it, except that those were the words that were said by some of the offenders during the rapes. And so they brought it on themselves, in a sense. But that was very bad for the Lebanese community, very bad, because they wore it all, and every Lebanese person, you know, felt like that the finger had been pointed at them, and that was most unfair, because this is a very tiny proportion of people who would act like this, and so very, very unfair. And I in the book I do tell the story about naming the offenders.
Because they were under suppression because they were kids.
Yes, that's right. And even naming Bilal's name would have named Mohammed,
right,
in a sense, because brothers and everything like that. So, but I made the submission in the end. I didn't know whether I should or not, but I made the submission to name them after a young Muslim law student who I was teaching at the time, lecturing, said, they've got to be named, otherwise our whole community has to wear it. That it should be the blame should be put on the people who did it, not on the whole community. And that you can't argue with logic like that. And the judge agreed, and so they were all named. And whilst their names now are so well known, but it is better than blaming a whole racial group.
Definitely. It's a shame we don't really know the other names as well. we just know the Skaf brothers.
Yes, well, they were named, but because there were two Skafs and Bilal was in all the trials, they're the ones that have worn it.
How were they caught in the end? Was it with the mobile phones that detectives tracked them down?
That was the main thing, the mobile phones, but not all were caught. Only 9 of the 15 were caught, and 1 or 2 of them got almost nothing really because certain proofs weren't available against them. There are 5 or 6 who got away with it.
And so we'll never know.
No, probably not. Probably not. I don't think there's DNA, but you never know. There was so much DNA taken, and methods of DNA keep coming back.
There ended up being a number of trials in the Skaf gang rapes. Were you involved in all of them?
Yes, I was. And so in fact, in the end, there were trials involving 4 complainants, two in one trial and 2 separate other ones. And there were other complainants where there were pleas of guilty entered, and they were a little less serious. But by then, the offenders knew that they were going to jail anyway, and they might as well fess up to some of the others. And the point had been made, and long sentences were imposed. Bilal's still in. None of the others are.
So he's the only one still in prison?
Yes.
Because something that stands out to me when you look back at this case is how they acted in court. There was no remorse, was there?
Oh, no.
They were laughing.
They were terribly badly behaved. But it must be said that they weren't very bright. They were tested and their IQs were exceedingly low. That's something that has to go into the mix about whether it was almost borderline on whether they should be sentenced as hard as people with at least average intelligence.
But like laughing in court and falling asleep,
throwing things at people, and laughing and disappearing and being on the ground and screaming out things, and they clearly had no respect for the judicial system. Do you know that something happened to me only about a month or 2 ago, and I didn't even expect to tell you this today because it just came back into my mind thinking about the other offenders. One of the other offenders who was right in there with, and his name was MG. It became. I was taken off a retrial in relation to him because of a lecture. So he ended up, and because that trial didn't succeed, even though he did time for one in which it did succeed, I do believe that he was involved in the other case that he was acquitted of because he had very distinctive hair. But anyway, I digress. 2 months ago, I was walking in Park Street, Sydney. I just got out of an Uber with some friends who were going a different way, and I was just going to peel off, and I was crossing Park Street to go and get a cab or bus or whatever. It was dark, and there was a beautiful white Ferrari purring at the lights. And I do like cars a lot. And it had gold trim and it was really new. And I'd never seen such a beautiful Ferrari. And it was making this beautiful noise. And I must confess that as I walked across in front of it in the dark, I was looking for it and looking at everything and not looking at the driver. When I got to the other side, the window wound down and said, "Margaret." And I said, "Hello." And he said, "Do you know who it is?" And I said, "No, but I like your car." And he said, It's him. MG. And he sped off. And I wasn't frightened or anything because he had a big smile on his face. And my goodness, he's got a Ferrari and I haven't.
But that's so many decades later as well.
Yes. But I suppose my face is still about.
Yeah.
And I am told as recently as yesterday that criminals in jails talk about lawyers a lot. And
that's so eerie though.
Yes, it was so eerie. I couldn't even believe it. And I texted my friends and I said, "You can't believe what just happened. I'm just telling you in case anything happens now." But he wasn't menacing, but he was...
He wanted you to know he was there though.
He was pretty triumphant.
Well, as you were mentioning, and I want to dig into it because he was acquitted of one of
Yes.
these charges. Tell me about being taken off the retrial.
Yes, well, it is an interesting case and I think a wrong case. I do think it was a wrong case because I was invited to give a prestigious lecture in 2005 to the University of Newcastle. It's called the Cernini and Stephen Lecture, and I was one of the few people more lowly than a judge who'd ever been invited to do it. And the dean, paid me a great honour in asking me, and so I prepared a lecture. It's a lecture, very carefully, and most of it wasn't about any cases at all. Most of it was to try to be inspiring to the first-year law students who were the target audience about the power that one gets from being a lawyer and how to be good with it, and how, I even said such things as it would be the worst nightmare of a prosecutor to think that he or she had prosecuted someone who was actually not guilty.
Which is a pretty obvious thing you would think to
yes,
say.
you would think so. I hope that always is the case. And so I thought it was good, but the dean had asked me to comment because he said so many of the students wonder why all the Skaf cases are still limping on through the system. It just hasn't come to an end, and there's more trials, and then there's an appeal, and then there's a retrial, and all that business. So I just gave a bit of a background of the allegations and the way it's gone through the courts, and I didn't even mention their names. I don't know if the names were public by then, probably not. I didn't mention their names. I mentioned them by initials so as to differentiate the cases and make it clear. And this is a university lecture, and it's pretty normal for lawyers to be able to lecture student lawyers about cases, even though they're still ongoing. When you're just mentioning the things that are in the public domain about
in open court,
the course of the trials and the appeals and why they're still going 5 years after the offences, and were still going for years after that. In 2007, when the fellow with who's now got a Ferrari, was up for trial again, some lawyers who didn't want me in the case, that's all it was about, they've told me since, thought they'd take a point that they didn't expect would, but they thought it'd buy some time with the Court of Criminal Appeal, saying that I should never be, as a prosecutor, I should never be talking about cases that I might be in the future. Publishing something, they said publishing. Actually, I didn't publish anything.
So you're a Crown Prosecutor. You're going to know if you're doing something that's legally dubious.
Yes, that's right. But this point was taken, and a judgment was given by the court. A leading judgment was then a judge who later went on to have some experience in sexual assault, but who said since, I didn't know how bad it was for victims for years, but he took me off it. He took me off the case and said I shouldn't be in it because I've made public comments about a case I might be in. And so the victim didn't come back. She didn't want to come back again, and they changed the legislation so that her evidence could be read and so forth. But it wasn't...
But she didn't come back again because you were taken off.
Yes, that's right. And
so
I promised her that I would stay with her through it always. and I couldn't keep my promise. But I'd go to, but anyway. And someone else did the case, not with the same knowledge. I'm not being at all critical, but there are things that had to be put across to a jury anyway. It was not successful. So Ferrari man, well, anyway, I shouldn't say that because things have to be proved beyond reasonable doubt, and it wasn't. And that's exactly how the system should prevail. But that's just my thoughts, and maybe I've gone too far yet again. But so
well, as far as we know, none of them are doing appeals right now, so we're fine.
Yeah, that's right. I think we're allowed to talk about it now, and that's just my view, no one else's view.
It's well known, though, that it's very hard to get a rape conviction. And even looking at this case, the amount of appeals and the amount of charges that weren't able to
well, it was much harder then than it is now.
But why do these cases struggle so much compared to like a murder case?
I don't think they do, really.
Really?
Yes, I think there's plenty of people being convicted.
Nowadays?
Oh, yes. Plenty of people being convicted.
DNA goes a long way,
and in
doesn't
fact, there's a few people being convicted where perhaps, an appeal will produce a different result. And if one looks at the raw statistics about how many convictions there are, and I don't even think that's changed a lot, if it is said that there's any slight reduction in conviction rates, it's because there are so many more complaints now.
Yeah, right.
And I don't want to offend anyone, and I hope that everyone understands what I'm saying, but that in terms of seriousness, objectively, and I know that for every victim it's their subjective feeling, but there are so many cases now in relation to, well, relationships, sex that is one person thinks it's been agreed to and one person doesn't, and perhaps it could be in the context of consensual sex to a certain extent or a certain number of times, and then something more. I'm not diminishing anyone's experience, but they're also harder to prove because the more aspects of things that are done to someone that are against their will, the easier it is to prove. So just as an example, if the complainant has removed her own clothes, gone to somewhere private, got into bed with someone, decided to sleep with someone, it's going to be a bit harder to prove that there wasn't consent to something happening. It's just a bit harder to prove because there are two sides to the story, and the truth of the matter is no one really knows except those two people.
Which is hard to hear, like you say, but you're speaking from like a courtroom perspective.
Yes.
Through a lawyer's eyes, it's much harder to distinguish than, say, the Skaf rapes that we're talking about.
And there can even be, each side there might be no dishonesty from either, but each side might remember it in a different way. And that, I suppose that's where communication is so important. And maybe that is why it's a good idea to change it to let's have the specific conversation rather than the old days of just a look in the eye and all things that came from Hollywood movies.
You mean asking for consent?
Yes, that's it. But not just generally, because many cases are cases where consent to certain acts have taken place, but there's got to be ongoing consent and continuous consent. But and many people say, "Oh, that's stupid," because I'm in a relationship and we don't talk about it and all that. But well, perhaps everyone has to have ground rules with people, and every couple's different.
And I would also argue that people that do feel like they've been sexually assaulted and raped in that scenario do deserve to be able to go to court and fight for justice.
Of course they do, and they are. And they are permitted to, and they're given every ability to make it easier. They don't have to be in the same room. They can do it by AVL. They can have as many breaks as they like, support person, all the things that we pioneered when I was prosecuting these types of cases.
Well, there were some changes in criminal procedure after Skaf, weren't there?
Yes, that someone doesn't have to come back time after time. So the evidence is recorded now, audio and visual, and so it can be used, even if the complainant doesn't want to come back, it doesn't matter whether she does or she doesn't. She could if she wanted to, but that recording is there for the future.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Bath. I'm speaking with Australian barrister and prosecutor Margaret Cunneen. Up next, I ask Margaret about the release of one of the more high-profile members of the Skaf rapes. Do you still read the headlines on the Skaf story? Because they are still popping up. You mentioned Mohammed before. He was released in 2023.
Yes, I like to see how everyone's going.
And we had another complainant come forward a few years ago. She was all over the media. It was something that was such a big part of your life.
Yeah, yes. Well, it was for a few years, and it certainly caused me, to be taken off.
Yeah.
It was
a lot of your own media attention.
Not only offensive, but it's sort of embarrassing. And yes, that's right. But the good thing was that in the judgment, my whole lecture is recorded. So I'm pretty proud. I'm still proud of it, and it's still a great lecture. And so things happen for a reason. They might seem terrible at the time, terribly offensive, but we have to get resilient and go through that in the course of professional life. People see things differently. I'm sure that wouldn't happen now. That was 2007. Imagine not being even given the opportunity to be represented in a case like that, which I wasn't. Wasn't asked a question about it, wasn't asked any explanation, wasn't given the opportunity. It just was done and I was off.
I want to ask about one of the cases you've worked on in your second act in defence, Craig Folbig. People will know that name. Kathleen Folbig was sentenced in the 90s or early 2000s for the murder and manslaughter of her 4 children. And you came to represent him in 2018. How did that come about?
I did. I was briefed by Craig Folbig's solicitor to appear in an inquiry before Reg Blanche QC, who was the first DPP. He appointed me a Crown Prosecutor back in 1990, and I'd worked for him as a solicitor in the DPP and since its inception. And so he was given the task of an inquiry into the convictions of Mrs. Folbig to see whether he agreed with them. And so for the first time she was cross-examined. She hadn't been cross-examined in her trials, as was her right. And I was instructed by Craig and through his lawyer. I came to know Craig very well. He's a very fine man, and on any view of it, a victim of the loss of 4 children. He died recently.
Did he?
He died within the last year, and he was quite young still, only in his 50s. And he went on to have another child, a son with a new partner, but he died after the last decision.
So he saw Kathleen freed.
Yes.
Which is something he doesn't think should have happened.
That's very true. That's very true. And I have a lot of insight from his suffering, and he told me often how he kept trusting her. But anyway, we know what's happened since. However, I cross-examined her, and I cross-examined her on her diaries. There's a lot of damaging material there. And at the end of that inquiry, Justice Blanche decided that he was more fortified in her guilt than had been the case even up to the High Court.
Really?
And that was on the basis of a number of, on the basis of her cross-examination. And we knew about the possible genetic difficulty suffered by 2 out of 4 of the children. One of the children, he was found to be not breathing, Patrick, early in his life, but he was saved for a while. He ended up blind and epileptic until he died a few months later with having stopped breathing. But anyway, there was a very big scientific campaign.
Well, it was interesting for you because you had not a small part, but you kind of played a part in the middle there, but not in the start and then not at the end. So you kind of got to see it all unravel.
Yes, that's right. It was a very interesting cross-examination. I think I cross-examined Mrs. Folbig for a day and a half.
And the first person to do so.
Yes.
I want to bring up ICAC.
Oh, good.
Because
bring up is very it makes me laugh.
Well, it was made into such a big deal. They dug into your life. They splashed it all over the news. It was, your private life, which you've made a very big deal to leave private, was kind of put out in the media, all for them to work out that you'd done nothing wrong.
That's right. And in fact, it was totally misconceived from the start because someone told them that somehow someone found out that my son's then girlfriend had a crash and found out that as it happened, she wasn't tested at the scene. But that's because the crash was so bad, the car was written off, the ambulance came and took her to the hospital where her blood was taken straight away. She went by ambulance with lights and sirens and her blood was taken. No alcohol, no drugs, and we knew that on the night. And
for it to become part of an ICAC inquiry.
Yes, and that's right. And as I kept saying to them, she was tested. And they, do you know that I think they thought that the police had helped me or something, but I wasn't there and neither was my son. And her phone, the driver's phone, was left in the car with her handbag because the car was T-boned. She was pinned by the seatbelts. up on the side of the car. She really did have chest pain when the ambulance came, and that's that. But the timing has always seemed very odd to me because I just completed a stint of about 18 months as a commissioner inquiring into the investigations of pedophile priests in Newcastle historically. And I just, the day before this crash, I had given my report to the governor. And so I was going back to my job. But there were all these rumours swirling about me being appointed as Supreme Court judge. Now, Gemma, I swear, had I been offered, I would have said no.
Really?
And just by means of a little bit of proof of that, in 2007, the then Attorney General, John Hatzistergos, who's now head of ICAC, which I think he's the best head they've ever had, frankly, and things are probably being done properly now there at last. But in 2007, I was rung up by the Attorney General and he said, oh, well, it's your turn, District Court Judge. You're going to take the appointment? And I said, no. What? No one ever knocks us back. And I said, oh, well, I am. And he said, why? And I said, look, I don't think I'm really judge material because whenever I'm doing a moot or something and one person speaks, I think, yeah, that's really good. And then the next person speaks, that's really good too. And I can't
Too much empathy.
I can't even choose. And I want to give both the prize. And I said, I really don't think that I'm very, very good at judging. Just leave me on a side. Give me a side to work for, and that's where I'm happy.
When you think about it, it's a very hard job. Like,
yes.
It's, to me, it's that typical, like, everyone expects you to keep climbing the ladder. And you're like, no, I'm happy moving laterally.
That's right. I had a great career and I loved it. And I wasn't too sure that I'd like it. And you know, I already had my own superannuation as a Crown Prosecutor. A lot of people go to be judges because if you do 10 years, you get superannuation. And that's why a lot of barristers will leave the bar and go and do it, I think. That no one's told me that, but that must be the attraction. But it didn't have that attraction for me either. And everyone that I've known who's become a judge, it's like losing your best friend to the priesthood or the nunnery because you basically never see them again, certainly not in the same way. If you see them at any function or something and you call them judge, they don't correct you. And there's no more lunches or drinks after work at the pub.
Why?
They think that everyone's going to be looking at them. And so, to one or two, I've said, don't worry, they won't be looking at you. They'll be looking at me. But they won't even notice you. But no, they won't go. They're sort of, their lives become a little more insular, which is pretty ironic because what you need to do criminal law is to know what's going on. And I got the bus here and walked the rest of the way. I love getting public transport. I love hanging around in ordinary department stores, grocery stores, pubs, footy. I love finding out what's really going on. And what's the use of just going around in a chauffeur-driven car, not talking to anyone?
That's so interesting. And interesting that you had that foresight and for them to be like, but why not? You're turning us down.
Yes.
But this all happened as ICAC was sniffing around.
Oh, yes. See how I changed the subject then?
I did. Let us get back to it. But you kind of smelled a bit of a rat there.
Well, yes, that's right. I think that there may have been forces at work who didn't want to see me. Well, we had that in common. No one wanted me to be a judge, mostly me. I think some people may have wanted me to, but some people didn't want me to be. And this was all just a big distraction, which had the inevitable when it was looked at by the ICAC inspector, the person who looks over ICAC, got hold of it straight away. I didn't even have to ask him to, and he initiated an investigation and found that they'd acted illegally, unjustly, unfairly, and with great prejudice against my family and me. And so there's a very damning report. But then even when a person there persisted on such personal basis, someone I'd known for ages anyway and worked with for ages, but persisted and tried to get my boss to punish me for something to do with a phone by taking all these phone messages and engineering a bias against me. So it sort of kept going on, but luckily it was sent to an independent prosecuting body in Victoria, and the result came back. There is no illegality by Ms. Cunneen or any member of her family. And, that some newspapers never print that, but some do.
Does it make you angry when you think back on it?
Oh, a little bit. But look, everyone's life has hardships in it. And even when that was happening and I was suspended from work and I was, I was mainly worried because they were dragging my family through it. And that's a tactic by bodies like ICAC, because if there was actually any evidence, it'd go straight to the police, wouldn't it, if of criminality. And the police had said, well, there's nothing to see here. That's made ICAC go after the police then and quiz them. But so ICACs only exist when there's no evidence, and so one of their tactics is to put pressure on all their family members by coming into the homes and going through everyone's stuff and surveilling family members to try to make the target go. Make it stop. I admit everything. Just stop against my family. But luckily, my family is a Praetorian Guard, and we're a martial arts family and a boxing family.
You
and,
are too.
And they all just keep fighting, Mum. Don't worry, we're all in it. We'll all fight.
Well, they picked the wrong family. But
And luckily, they're not a family who looked at me and said, "Oh, what have you done? Oh, I'm so embarrassed by you." They just got prouder and prouder of me.
But to me, it seems that you kept getting this target on your back. When you would speak out about something, you would kind of question processes, or you would be like, "Hey, why don't we do this differently?" Or
well, that's right. Isn't it kind of ironic that I was speaking up for victims of rape, having such a hard time and having to go back to courts over and over again and being treated so badly because certain people in the system who would now totally agree with that hadn't yet come around to it and might be taking the credit for it when I was really pilloried for it. In fact, even down to being questioned by people who may be ashamed of it now. These prosecutions are just racist prosecutions because they're nice white girls with blonde hair, and so you're just for Aussies and against Lebanese people. This is terrible. I was able to say when I was asked that question by people who it surprised me when they asked it, namely women's groups, I said, why do you say that they're blonde-haired girls? Oh, I saw one on a current affair. Well, actually, she's an Aboriginal woman who was wearing a blonde wig and green contacts to disguise her appearance. And when she was first spoken to on the train by Mohammed Skaf, he, noting that it's not entirely clear what her ethnic derivation is, he said to her, are you an Aussie? Where do you come from? And she said, I'm as Australian as they come.
So that'll tell them.
Yes. So, that kind of quietens the group down.
What's next for you?
Thanks. Some people say, when are you going to retire? And I say,
no.
Do you think I should?
No. What's next?
Well, thanks for asking, Gemma. I've got a pretty full book of trials right into the next year. And as it keeps happening, people are still asking me for trials that'll probably go into the year after that. And so I figure that the clientele will decide when I've had enough, because I've seen people be too old for this job, although it's a great job for an older person because juries trust your wisdom, and especially if you can render the stories in the common parlance, which I think I can. I spend a lot of time in pubs drinking beers with my kids and their mates.
Young mentees as well, thrown in.
And that's exactly right. As long as you keep in touch, it's still a great advantage. It's a job where being old is quite an advantage, but it starts to run out, and I hope I'll have the sense to know that I'm getting a bit past it in maybe 10 years.
Thanks to Margaret for helping us to tell this story and for sharing so much of her own. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, and Tali Blackman, with audio design by Jacob Round. And a huge thank you to all of you, our amazing listeners. We're so grateful to have you back for another year of the podcast. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show. Your feedback means so much to us. One easy way to share your thoughts is by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. Just scroll down to the bottom of your podcast page, click Write a Review and add a star rating. You can also contact us direct at truecrime@mamamia.com.au. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.